adversity, adversity, adverse, adverse, standpoint, standpoint, optimist, optimist, optimism, optimism, optimistic, optimistic, pessimist, pessimist, pessimism, pessimism, pessimistic, pessimistic, seal, seal,
Hey. Hey. Era. Era.
glitter, glitter, radical, radical, radically, radically, accumulate, accumulate, accumulation, accumulation, oblige, oblige,
Obligate. Obligate.
obligation, obligation, obligatory, obligatory, barbaric, barbaric, barbarian, barbarian, barbarism, barbarism, barbarous, barbarous, flexible, flexible, inflexible, inflexible, gaze, gaze,
Defect. Defect.
contemplate, contemplate, contemplation, contemplation, perish, perish, perishable, perishable, utility, utility, utilize, utilize, utilization, utilization, crust, crust, issue, issue, shrug, shrug, rod, rod, foam, foam, foamy, foamy,
Have. Have.
pavement, pavement, trim, trim, suspend, suspend, suspension, suspension, append, append, appendix, appendix, pendulum, pendulum, request, request, acquire, acquire, acquirement, acquirement, inquire, inquire, inquiry, inquiry, require, require, requirement, requirement,
Fall into adversity. Fall into adversity. A man in adversity. A man in adversity. Be schooled in adversity. Be schooled in adversity. Courage in the face of adversity. Courage in the face of adversity. Adverse opinion. Adverse opinion. Produce adverse effect. Produce adverse effect. Adverse weather conditions. Adverse weather conditions. Adverse circumstances. Adverse circumstances. Adverse fate. Adverse fate. An adverse budget. An adverse budget. An adverse wind. An adverse wind. Adverse to slavery. Adverse to slavery. The adverse page. The adverse page. Adverse criticism. Adverse criticism. Adverse publicity. Adverse publicity. An adverse balance of trade. An adverse balance of trade. Define one's standpoint. Define one's standpoint. State one's standpoint. State one's standpoint. Economic standpoint. Economic standpoint. A political standpoint. A political standpoint. From our standpoint. From our standpoint. From a practical standpoint. From a practical standpoint. From a common sense standpoint. From a common sense standpoint. A born optimist. A born optimist. A light-hearted optimist. A light-hearted optimist. A poet optimist. A poet optimist. Line optimism. Line optimism. A mood of cautious optimism. A mood of cautious optimism. Guarded optimism. Guarded optimism. Show optimism. Show optimism. Optimism about the future. Optimism about the future. Optimism for the future. Optimism for the future. Over-optimistic. Over-optimistic. In an optimistic mood. In an optimistic mood. An optimistic estimate. An optimistic estimate. An optimistic view. An optimistic view. A weak-kneed pessimist. A weak-kneed pessimist. A sullen pessimist. A sullen pessimist. A vein of pessimism. A vein of pessimism. Display pessimism. Display pessimism.
Overcome pessimism. Overcome pessimism. Constructive pessimism. Constructive pessimism. A pessimistic view of life. A pessimistic view of life. A pessimistic view. A pessimistic view. A pessimistic note. A pessimistic note. A pessimistic prediction. A pessimistic prediction. Feel pessimistic. Feel pessimistic. A pessimistic tone. A pessimistic tone. A negative outlook. A negative outlook. A sealed bed. A sealed bed. You seal a contract. You seal a contract. A colony of seals. A colony of seals. A bale of hay. A bale of hay. Make hay. Make hay. Put a field under hay. Put a field under hay. Post-war era. Post-war era. Mark a new era. Mark a new era. An era of progress. An era of progress. The Paleozoic era. The Paleozoic era. The Mohammedan era. The Mohammedan era. The Christian era. The Christian era. The glitter of diamonds. The glitter of diamonds. Gold glitter. Gold glitter. Silver glitter. Silver glitter. Glitter like gold. Glitter like gold. Glitter with golden color. Glitter with golden color. Glitter with precious stones. Glitter with precious stones. A radical formula. A radical formula. A radical cure. A radical cure. A radical reform. A radical reform. A radical party. A radical party. Radical students. Radical students. A radical form. A radical form. A radical word. A radical word. Radical growths. Radical growths. Radical defects. Radical defects. Radical ideas. Radical ideas. Radical proposals. Radical proposals. Political radicals. Political radicals. Radically different. Radically different. Change radically. Change radically. Accumulate know-how. Accumulate know-how. Accumulate wealth. Accumulate wealth. Amass wealth. Amass wealth. Make a fortune. Make a fortune. Accumulate a fortune. Accumulate a fortune.
Illegally accumulate wealth. Illegally accumulate wealth. Accumulate trash. Accumulate trash. An accumulated fund. An accumulated fund. The accumulation of wealth. The accumulation of wealth. An accumulation of rubbish. An accumulation of rubbish. The accumulation of freights. The accumulation of freights. Oblige civil person. Oblige civil person. Noblesse oblige. Noblesse oblige. Oblige and humor his desires. Oblige and humor his desires. Obligate runner. Obligate runner. Obligate anaerobe. Obligate anaerobe. Moral obligation. Moral obligation. To fulfill your legal obligations. To fulfill your legal obligations. Sense of obligation. Sense of obligation. A joint obligation. A joint obligation. Legal obligation. Legal obligation. A national obligation. A national obligation. Moral obligation. Moral obligation. Moral duty. Moral duty. Attend out of obligation. Attend out of obligation. Participate out of obligation. Participate out of obligation. An obligatory promise. An obligatory promise. Duties obligatory on all. Duties obligatory on all. The obligatory term. The obligatory term. An obligatory subject. An obligatory subject. An compulsory subject. An compulsory subject. A barbaric custom. A barbaric custom. Barbaric races. Barbaric races. A barbaric act. A barbaric act. A barbaric ritual. A barbaric ritual. Barbaric invaders. Barbaric invaders. A barbaric empire. A barbaric empire. Barbaric decorations. Barbaric decorations. Barbaric vigor. Barbaric vigor. Barbarian customs. Barbarian customs. A barbarian custom. A barbarian custom. The barbarism of war. The barbarism of war. Utter barbarism. Utter barbarism. A state of barbarism. A state of barbarism. Live in barbarism. Live in barbarism.
Display barbarism. display barbarism, an act of barbarism, an act of barbarism, fascist barbarism, fascist barbarism, commit an act of barbarism, commit an act of barbarism, a barbarous act, a barbarous act, bad taste, bad taste, barbarous taste, barbarous taste, a barbarous custom, a barbarous custom, a uncivilized custom, a uncivilized custom, barbarous treatment, barbarous treatment, barbarous conduct, barbarous conduct, barbarous countries, barbarous countries, barbarous peoples, barbarous peoples, barbarous habits, barbarous habits, wilding barbarous music, wilding barbarous music, a barbarous jargon, a barbarous jargon, a barbarous locution, a barbarous locution, a barbarous pronunciation, a barbarous pronunciation, a more flexible approach, a more flexible approach, flexible thinking, flexible thinking, flexible working hours, flexible working hours, a flexible rule, a flexible rule, a flexible wire, a flexible wire, a flexible mind, a flexible mind, a flexible attitude, a flexible attitude, work flexible hours, work flexible hours, inflexible rules, inflexible rules, inflexible determination, inflexible determination, an inflexible attitude, an inflexible attitude, an inflexible will, an inflexible will, an inflexible political posture, an inflexible political posture, during the first phase, during the first phase, a critical phase, a critical phase, the design phase, the design phase, enter on a new phase, enter on a new phase, a problem with many phases, a problem with many phases, phase difference, phase difference, the design phase, the design phase, phase zero, phase zero, a speech defect, a speech defect, mass defect, mass defect, compensate the defect, compensate the defect, a defect in the glass, a defect in the glass,
Conceal a defect. Conceal a defect. A physical defect. A physical defect. An optical defect. An optical defect. To contemplate your future. To contemplate your future. Contemplate nature. Contemplate nature. Contemplate life. Contemplate life. Contemplate a problem. Contemplate a problem. Contemplate a trip. Contemplate a trip. Contemplate improvements. Contemplate improvements. Contemplate suicide. Contemplate suicide. Be in contemplation. Be in contemplation. Be under contemplation. Be under contemplation. An enterprise under contemplation. An enterprise under contemplation. Be deep in contemplation. Be deep in contemplation. Be sunk in contemplation. Be sunk in contemplation. Be lost in contemplation. Be lost in contemplation. Do a perish. Do a perish. Perishable foods. Perishable foods. Perishable cargo. Perishable cargo. Perishable produce. Perishable produce. The administration of public utilities. The administration of public utilities. Hey, utility bills. Hey, utility bills. Utility vehicle. Utility vehicle. Marginal utility. Marginal utility. Utility furniture. Utility furniture. Utility clothes. Utility clothes. An all-around utility player. An all-around utility player. Increase water utility bills. Increase water utility bills. Increase public utility fees. Increase public utility fees. Utilize fully. Utilize fully. Utilize camouflage. Utilize camouflage. Utilize the existing facilities. Utilize the existing facilities. Utilize in the real world. Utilize in the real world. Utilize solar radiation. Utilize solar radiation. Utilization rate. Utilization rate. Capacity utilization. Capacity utilization. Bread crust. Bread crust. A thin crust of ice. A thin crust of ice.
The Earth's crust. The Earth's crust. Crust movement. Crust movement. Icy crust. Icy crust. Earn one's crust. Earn one's crust. Back issue. Back issue. A New Year issue. A New Year issue. The March issue of magazine. The March issue of magazine. The second issue. The second issue. Side issue. Side issue. Non-issue. Non-issue. A controversial issue. A controversial issue. A sensitive issue. A sensitive issue. A key issue. A key issue. An issue of law. An issue of law. Raise a new issue. Raise a new issue. Debate an issue. Debate an issue. The day of issue. The day of issue. The issue of stamps. The issue of stamps. The issue of coinage. The issue of coinage. Today's issue of a newspaper. Today's issue of a newspaper. The issue of a contest. The issue of a contest. Bring a matter to an issue. Bring a matter to an issue. Abide the issue. Abide the issue. Die without issue. Die without issue. A new issue. A new issue. Water issuing from the rock. Water issuing from the rock. Issue forth. Issue forth. Issue out. Issue out. Smoke issuing from a volcano. Smoke issuing from a volcano. Issue orders. Issue orders. Issue invitations. Issue invitations. Issue a statement. Issue a statement. Issue a passport. Issue a passport. Issue a visa. Issue a visa. Issue a warrant. Issue a warrant. Issue a book. Issue a book. Shrug one's shoulders. Shrug one's shoulders. A curtain rod. A curtain rod. A rod and line. A rod and line. Fish with rod and line. Fish with rod and line. Give the rod. Give the rod. Use a rod. Use a rod. Kiss the rod. Kiss the rod. Fuel rod. Fuel rod. Foam bubbles. Foam bubbles. Foam up. Foam up. Foam over. Foam over. Foam off. Foam off. Foam away. Foam away. Foam insulation. Foam insulation. Foam packaging. Foam packaging. Foam at the mouth. Foam at the mouth. Shaving foam. Shaving foam. Foam with rage. Foam with rage. Foamy adhesive. Foamy adhesive. Foamy virus. Foamy virus. Pave a road. Pave a road. Pave a street. Pave a street. Pave with asphalt. Pave with asphalt. A pavement cafe. A pavement cafe. Pavement artist. Pavement artist. Put pavement. Put pavement. Hit the pavement. Hit the pavement. To trim your hair. To trim your hair. To trim a hedge. To trim a hedge. To trim a beard. To trim a beard. Trim one's nails. Trim one's nails. Trim a woman's hat. Trim a woman's hat. Trim one's course. Trim one's course. Give a person a trim. Give a person a trim. The trim on the dress. The trim on the dress. In marching trim. In marching trim. In fighting trim. In fighting trim. In hunting trim. In hunting trim. In sailing trim. In sailing trim. A trim house. a trim house, a trim lawn, a trim lawn, a trim costume, a trim costume, a trim ship, a trim ship, suspend service, suspend service, suspend payment, suspend payment, suspend one's indignation, suspend one's indignation, suspend a privilege, suspend a privilege, suspend a law, suspend a law, suspend a motor license, suspend a motor license, suspend operations, suspend operations, suspend business, suspend business, he suspend judgment, he suspend judgment, suspend a lamp from the ceiling, suspend a lamp from the ceiling, suspend judgment, suspend judgment, suspend sentence, suspend sentence, suspension from school, suspension from school, suspension of arms, suspension of arms, suspension of hostilities, suspension of hostilities, suspension bridge, suspension bridge, get a license suspension, get a license suspension,
Does particles in suspension in air. Does particles in suspension in air. Be under suspension. Be under suspension. Issue a business suspension. Issue a business suspension. Impose a business suspension. Impose a business suspension. Suspension of traffic. Suspension of traffic. Suspension of sentence. Suspension of sentence. Suspension period. Suspension period. Add notes. Add notes. Append notes. Append notes. Append a clause to a treaty. Append a clause to a treaty. Append a label to a trunk. Append a label to a trunk. Add an appendix. Add an appendix. Vermiform appendix. Vermiform appendix. A ruptured appendix. A ruptured appendix. Pendulum movement. Pendulum movement. A simple pendulum. A simple pendulum. A compound pendulum. A compound pendulum. The pendulum of public opinion. The pendulum of public opinion. Swing a pendulum. Swing a pendulum. A pendulum clock. A pendulum clock. Request stop. Request stop. Request bail. Request bail. A radio request program. A radio request program. By request. By request. Be much in request. Be much in request. Come into request. Come into request. Obtain one's request. Obtain one's request. Grant a person's request. Grant a person's request. Request permission. Request permission. Request candid consideration. Request candid consideration. Request anonymity. Request anonymity. Request for rescue. Request for rescue. An impudent request. An impudent request. Pass along a request. Pass along a request. Acquire a loan. Acquire a loan. Acquire land. Acquire land. Acquire the art of public speaking. Acquire the art of public speaking. Acquire a habit. Acquire a habit. Acquire a language. Acquire a language. Acquire a foreign language. Acquire a foreign language. Acquirement of nationality. Acquirement of nationality. Acquirement of land by compulsion. Acquirement of land by compulsion. Inquire the reason. Inquire the reason. Ask the reason. Ask the reason. Inquire into the origin. Inquire into the origin. Inquire into truth. Inquire into truth. Inquire minutely. Inquire minutely. Inquire for the way. Inquire for the way. Inquire into a matter. Inquire into a matter. Inquire into the cause. Inquire into the cause. Court of inquiry. Court of inquiry. A letter of inquiry. A letter of inquiry. A scientific inquiry. A scientific inquiry.
receive an inquiry, receive an inquiry, an internal inquiry, an internal inquiry, inquiry agent, inquiry agent, inquiry agency, inquiry agency, inquiry office, inquiry office, a writ of inquiry, a writ of inquiry, confidential inquiry, confidential inquiry, credit inquiry, credit inquiry, a commission of inquiry, a commission of inquiry, require attention, require attention, require care, require care, require know-how, require know-how, require much labor, require much labor, require rest in bed, require rest in bed, require much trouble, require much trouble. A residency requirement for students. A residency requirement for students. The basic requirements of life. The basic requirements of life. To meet the requirements. To meet the requirements. The requirements for college admission. The requirements for college admission. Meet the requirements of the times. Meet the requirements of the times. Age requirement. Age requirement. Waive a requirement. Waive a requirement. A physiological requirement. A physiological requirement. A physiological necessity. A physiological necessity. Registration requirement. Registration requirement.